So it was the Apple One More Thing event last night where they finally unveiled the new M1 chips, which are going to replace all of the Intel chips in the Mac lineup. So what does this mean for you and your creative lifestyle? We'll discuss that in this video. So it was a really exciting event last night, and it was great to see these M1 chips and just see what they can actually do. So if you have a Mac at the moment, you will definitely have an Intel chip inside. So over the next 2 years, Apple is going to transition from Intel chips to their new M1 chips. Now, Apple aren't new to chips. They've actually been making these ARM-based chips for iPhones and iPad Pros. And if you've been looking at how iPad Pros run over the last few years, you know they run super fast. So they showed off a little bit of what the chips can do, and they seem blisteringly fast. So what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to try and keep it short and just go over some of the new specs and what it will actually mean for your workflow. So the new M1 chip features an 8-core CPU, which Apple claims will use 1/4 of the power of a similar based Intel chip. There's also 16 billion transistors packed inside this tiny chip, which is absolutely crazy. There's also an 8-core GPU on this chip, which Apple claims is the fastest integrated graphics chip on the market today. So you should see 5 times faster graphics with this new chip. So according to Apple, all of your programs and apps should now run super fast. But in addition to that, we're also seeing a huge improvement in battery life. The MacBook Pro is going from around 8 to 10 hours to 20 hours of battery life. So anyway, let's take a look at some of the new Macs that Apple have released with this new M1 chip and what you get with them. So firstly, they announced the new MacBook Air. Now, the design looks the same, but of course, you get this new M1 chip. So basically, you get an 8-core CPU, which Apple claims is 3.5 times faster due to 4 performance cores. You get a GPU which is 5 times faster, and you get the longest battery life on any MacBook Air ever released, which is pretty cool. It's now up to 18 hours of battery life, which gives it 6 more hours than the previous version. Now, most people who buy a MacBook Air are not editing video, but if you do use Final Cut Pro on a MacBook Air, this new one should be 3.9 times faster than last year's baseline model. So that's pretty incredible, and I can't wait to see how apps like Final Cut Pro run on this new MacBook Air. Even in programs like Lightroom, we're seeing a 2.3 times improvement on export speeds too. Now, the pricing on the MacBook Air hasn't changed much either. So you're getting this new processor, and it starts at $999 here in the UK, and that's for the 8-core CPU, 7-core GPU, and 256 gigabytes of SSD storage and 8 gigs of RAM. Now, you can take it up to £1,249, and you get an 8-core CPU, an 8-core GPU, and you get 512 gigabytes of storage, which is pretty good. Now, they also released a new Mac Mini, and this shares many of the specs from the MacBook Air. So I'm not going to go over this in too much detail, but if you are a Mac Mini user, you'll be pleased to know they actually have reduced the price, and the base model now starts at £699 here in the UK. Now, what I was surprised to see was a new MacBook Pro. I thought they would just trial this out on maybe a MacBook Air and maybe the Mac Mini. Wait to see how it goes, wait to see how the programs run and people, feel about using this new chip before they went to the iMacs and the MacBook Pro. Now, they didn't release an iMac, but they have released a MacBook Pro. And so the specs here, for £1,249 here in the UK, you get the new M1 processor. And Apple says this new MacBook Pro is 2.8 times faster than the previous baseline model, which is pretty crazy. They're also saying you get 5 times faster graphics. So this will be a big improvement. If you're someone who edits video on last year's MacBook Pro baseline models, you should see a huge increase in sort of video encoding and exporting times. So they're saying Final Cut Pro will transcode video 2.8 times faster compared to the previous baseline MacBook Pro, and Logic Pro X can run 1.8 times faster, which is a pretty massive speed improvement, just to go from 1 year to the next. So I'm really interested in seeing this. Other specs, if you play Tomb Raider, you'll see a 2.9 times faster game performance. There's also a 16-core neural engine, and a neural engine is good for machine learning, and this means you'll see massive improvements to photo and video editing. Another big thing here, as mentioned previously, is battery life. The MacBook Pro now is going to have up to 20 hours of battery life. I mean, who works for 20 hours in a day? So this means really your MacBook Pro on one full charge could probably get you through 2 full days of work, or just one really heavy day's work. So that's amazing to see. It doesn't cost any more and you're getting almost double the battery life. So pricing, this starts at $1,299 for the base M1 model here in the UK, and that's an 8-core CPU and an 8-core GPU. You can spend a little bit more, it goes up to £1,499. It's the same spec, but you do get a 512 gigabyte SSD. Now you can actually add up to 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 2 terabyte SSD, and this will cost £2,299, which puts it in the same kind of price bracket as the Intel models. It's slightly cheaper, but as yet we don't know how programs are going to run on this. And that gets me onto the next point. So they're the new Macs, but what other additions do you get and what problems may you face? So with all of these new Macs, you're going to get instant wake, and that means when you open up your laptop, it will start much quicker than the current MacBook Pros, which is pretty good. Any new Mac running this new M1 processor can also run iPad apps. So this is great if you use something like LumaFusion that we use a lot here at Editor's Keys. If you're used to using that on your iPad Pro, you can now edit video with LumaFusion on your MacBook Pro, which is going to be really interesting to see. One thing I'm a little bit worried about is how complicated will this be for some people. You know, if you search for Photoshop in the App Store on an iPad, there's about 10 versions of Photoshop you can get: the Photoshop Mix, Photoshop Fix, the full version of Photoshop. And if you couple that with the desktop versions, is this going to make it a little bit more complicated? And of course, our MacBook Pro still isn't touchscreen, so how will these iPad apps run? We're going to be testing that out in a future video, so if you want to see that, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Other improvements, there's a new Facetime HD camera finally, so if you are in lockdown or working from home, you should get much better quality FaceTime or Zoom video calls. We'll be testing that out again in a new video. There's Wi-Fi 6 for fast internet browsing, which is really good to see. I've used Wi-Fi 6 on some other devices, and it really does make a difference, especially in range. I've noticed that I can go in my back garden and work further away from the back of the house and still get a good internet reception. Now, this all sounds really good, but before you rush out to buy one of these new Macs, are there any problems that you could face? Well, one issue that we've seen with the Surface Pro X is that when these machines are released, Apple have, of course, updated their own apps like Final Cut, Safari, Mail. They will all run perfectly on this new M1 chip. But Adobe apps haven't been recompiled for the M1 chip, so it does mean they're going to be emulated in something called Rosetta 2. Now, I'm old enough to remember the jump between the PowerPC and Intel, and Rosetta 1 actually handled a lot of the emulation pretty well. Some apps were a little bit slow. I remember Microsoft Office having a lot of problems at the time. Of course, Apple have had a long time to try and get this right, so I'm hoping that if you run Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Premiere, or Illustrator, or any other program that isn't yet built for the M1 processor, it will of course be emulated, but the question is, how well will this be emulated? Will you be able to use it without noticing any difference? Or, like the Microsoft Surface Pro X, will you see some stutters and lags, and will it make some of your programs almost unusable? Now, I'm hoping that Apple is going to get this right, and Apple, as you know, usually does do this thing right. But anyway, we're going to get a machine in, and if you want to see a test of how the new version of Final Cut runs on this, and how apps that aren't built for this new M1 chip run, such as Photoshop, Premiere, Adobe Audition, we're going to test it out on this new Mac. So if you want to learn more about that, if you want to see a review of the new MacBook Pro, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, and then you'll be notified as soon as that review is live. So anyway, thanks for watching. If you've got any questions at all, leave them below, as we do get back to every single one, and I'll see you in the next video.